Thank you for the generous introduction. Uh, we are very happy to be here. I'm happier still to be sitting here in the midst of a very esteemed panel, panelists who have contributed in a big way to translation and translation studies and what translation means for us in India today. We're all grappling with this idea of India, with opposing camps telling us that India is this and India is that. And trying to put our finger on it, I think, are the translators who are trying to build bridges to tell stories from one side to the other side and to create better reception among readers and listeners. That's why this session is a very fascinating session, apart from the fact that a 1 billion trillion or something dollar industry rests on the shoulders of translators. Over here, my fellow panelists here are putting out more serious issues related to translation and how we can go about what social mobility in India has done. It has made us move up, move sideways, move all around the country. I was talking to people at lunch, and invariably, I found that, people are of mixed parentages. So if you have somebody if the father's from the south, mother's from the north, or east and west, or one state from Tamil Nadu and another from Maharashtra, and so there is a general feeling of dissatisfaction. It's not only the politicians who are concerned about nation building. People of ideas are equally concerned, and Bangalore Lit Fest is out to prove that. So we are trying to map this route that we have taken to understand ourselves. And translation, I think, is a nice way of doing it, of coming to terms with what we are and the stories we tell about ourselves, how others have seen us, how they have viewed us, their interpretations of what we are, how we agree, how we disagree, and how we put it into language again. If there's anyone who believes in reincarnation, I think it's us translators who think that we should have been authors, and now here we are trying to be an author in disguise, borrowing stories and retelling them. Now, from all that we hear, pitch is very important, so I'll ask Madhav to pitch it on home ground and take us through the history of translation in Kannada and how different people have handled it and how he, as a translator, intends presenting his work to us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Am I audible? Yeah, sounds like I am. Thanks, Susan, for the very nice introduction, and I think she's raised a lot of matters that deserve discussion. As far as I'm concerned, I'm mostly here in my capacity as a translator of Bendre, the 20th century Kannada poet called the Varakavi in Kannada. And given that the panel's name, or rather the session's titled Changes in Translation and Translation for Change, we thought we could talk about both matters. All of us would talk about both matters. And as far as changes in translation is concerned, I think one thing worth noting is how, like Susan said, now translation is not simply something that's confined to academic life like it was perhaps earlier. People need to translate between languages at home even, given that they're of mixed parentage, let's say. And so it's worth looking at how translation itself has changed across, say, a century or thereabouts, because Kannada literature and most Indian literature began to be translated into English about a century or so ago. There were sensibilities that were different then and that are different now. And I think it's worth discussing how it's changed. So as far as Kannada is concerned, there was this notion when Bendre and Kuempu and Puti Narasimhachar and all of them began to write, the early romantics, that the poetry they wrote was influenced by the early or the English romantics, and so the style that their poetry needed to be translated in was also something that needed to be romantic in its presentation, despite their rootedness over here. And that didn't quite happen, which is what I'd like to show you in this fashion. For example, uh, there's this ನೆಲದ ಬಸಿರಳು ನೆಲದ ಬಸಿರಳು ಉರಿಯುತ್ತಿದೆ, ಬೆಟ್ಟದೆದೆಯು ಬಿರಿಯುತ್ತಿದೆ, ನೀರು ಮೀರಿ ಹರಿಯುತ್ತಿದೆ ಕೆಂಪು ನೆಲದಲ್ಲಿ. An earlier translation goes, earth's volcanic again, the mountains split amain, and the dikes dam streams in vain as they slake the red soil. So again, the translators look to keep the end rhyme, but words like amain and all that give away the kind of datedness of the translation, words that we don't really see nowadays and that attest to datedness, in fact. And change, if you will, a change in translation of the same lines that I've made is, the fire within earth's womb is lit, the mountain's very heart has split, the rising waters have now spilt over the reddened land. So the idea is that it's more colloquial, that it's more prose-like in some ways, more contemporary, and approximating the contemporary nature of Bendre's poetry himself, or itself. And if I could offer one more example before handing the mic over, there's this well-known poem by Bendre whose poetry was almost made for song. This is called Nagi Navilu. And the first couple of stanzas go this way. Nari ninna mari myaga nagi navilu ಆಡತಿತ್ತ ಆಡತಿತ್ತ ಓಡತಿತ್ತ ಮುಗಿಲ ಕಡೆಗೆ ನೋಡತಿತ್ತ ಮಿನ 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 ಮಿಂಚತಿತ್ತ ಮೂಡತಿತ್ತ ಮುಳುಗತಿತ್ತ ಮುಳುಗತಿತ್ತ ತೊಳಗತಿತ್ತ ನೆಲ ಜಲ ಬೆಳಗತಿತ್ತ. So the earlier translation says, woman in your face, the peacock smile was dancing, dancing and sunning, gazing at the sky, shining swiftly like lightning, rising and sinking, sinking and drowning earth and water in a light of laughter. They've tried to be rather literal and more or less ignored the nada of it, the euphony of it. I came across it as song, and if you'll let me sing the first two and then offer my translation. Nari ninna mari myaga nagi navilu ಆಡತಿತ್ತ ಆಡತಿತ್ತ ಓಡತಿತ್ತ ಮುಗಿಲ ಕಡೆಗೆ ನೋಡತಿತ್ತ ಮಿನ 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 ಮಿಂಚತಿತ್ತ ಮೂಡತಿತ್ತ ಮುಳಗತಿತ್ತ ಮುಳಗತಿತ್ತ ತೊಳಗತಿತ್ತ ನೆಲ ಜಲ ಬೆಳಗತಿತ್ತ. And the translation goes, woman upon your lips did play a peacock smile, did play a smile, did flee a smile, did it look cloudward the while? A flash, the smile, did rise the smile, did fall the smile, did fall the smile, did glow the smile, did the land and waters gleam the while. So, thank you. So, as an example of change is in translation, this is how translation, I think, changes across eras, as it were, and how translators renew a text in order to make it contemporary. So with that, who shall we go to next?
We finish the literary folk first.
Okay.
Finish them off. So anyway, can I ask you, Ms. Susheela Punitha, what are the constraints you have faced really as a translator? Has social, economic preoccupations been a consideration? Is that why somebody the text that you have translated, has someone done it before you? Have you made drastic changes to it, or were you the first translator of those? You were the first translator.
Except for the first one, yeah.
Ananthamurthy's Bharati.
Already been done.
Yeah, there's an old...
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah, all the rest that I have done are the first translations, except for the very first one, Bharatipura. In fact, that was quite scary for me because that was my first assignment from OUP. And I had never translated before. And what was even worse is that they told me that it had already been translated and Anantmurthy had not accepted it. And they wanted me to do this, and this was my first attempt.
But did
So,
you read? Did
yeah,
you
it
read
was
that
quite
translation?
scary. It was quite scary. But
Yeah.
then after I did it, I didn't want to read the other translation before, but after I did mine, and when I checked that, I could make out why he didn't like it. That was purely academic. And can I carry on?
Yes.
Yeah, because you see, the earliest translations into English were mainly kind of a, what would you call it? They had a didactic purpose, like say the translation of the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, even Ramayana, Mahabharata, all these. They require, maybe they required or they didn't, but anyway, the English who translated them into the formal English style. So it was difficult initially for our writers, academic translators, to change from that style, I think, because this gentleman's Bharatipura was purely academic. And I changed it. I changed the flavor, making it local, more local, because I feel that a text should not read like an English text. A translated text has to read like a translated text from that language. So I'll carry on with that later. Come here.
Yes, if we can continue this debate before we come to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
This question of, how far is the translator influenced by his time, the period in which he writes, all that matters also.
Yeah, of course
So,
it does. Yeah, of course.
So if we are to judge writers or translators who've gone before us, we are going to be judged in the same way by writers who come after us. So what is the allowance we give? That's one point I'd like to raise. The other thing is, we as English-speaking, English-educated Indians haven't evolved what we were discussing prior to our meeting here. We haven't evolved any kind of dialect in English, except what we think is some standard English, which is largely influenced by our English education, or by reading texts in English. That being the case, we cannot break away from this prescribed standard English. We haven't evolved, say, like the Caribbeans have. We don't have any dialect or idiolect, except, like you said, rightly pointed out, wrong English. So we have right English and wrong English. That's all the English we have. And a good part of the mess that we have created with wrong English.
No, this is extremely important, I think. As
Good
far as
point.
translating is concerned, my own translations, I never really looked at earlier translations because I began without knowledge that there were earlier translations, and then also because I preferred to do them myself. But like Susan says, in the case of Bendre especially, he wrote in a kind of a what they call a dialect of Kannada, though it may be fair given what he did with it to call it the standard Kannada and the rest are dialects. But what he did was elevate a certain kind of Kannada, the Harvard Kannada, to literary heights. I mean, really make it sublime in some ways. And so we were discussing it, Susan and I, how this could be achieved in English. And I've talked about it in my book too, and I always wondered how it could be done. I mean, would it work to maybe use Cockney or Northumbrian or Mancunian? But none of those are familiar to me, nor are they used in English poetry itself, let alone being familiar to me. The English poets themselves don't quite use those dialects in standard poetry, at least in the 20th century. And so how was I to make Bendre contemporary? And the method I sort of chose eventually was something that resembled contemporary English poetry, which is almost shorn of any of those earlier flourishes and the romantic idiom. Because his poetry was extremely contemporary for its time and modern, and so it seemed like the only way to bring him across into English was to be modern. And English, modern English, like you said, Susan, doesn't have anything, or we Indians haven't created a modern English of our own to bring it into. I was talking with Susan about something, a recent translated text I came across. I'm not quite sure who the translator is or the author, but the, it's titled The Story of Two Women Named Kalyani and Dakshayani. And it's just that it's spelled, story is spelled S-T-H-O-R-Y, and women is spelled W-I-M-M-I-N. Otherwise, it's just English. The story of two women named Kalyani and Dakshayani. And the whole text sort of proceeds this way. It's English differently spelled if you're being kind, and badly spelled if you're being sort of not so kind. And so this question of moving across languages without a dialect or without an English of our own, like Creole, I think you're referring to in the Caribbean, or Ebonics as they call Black English, will always, I think, remain a problem and will have to be navigated in different ways. In my case, I used Bendre's Nada, the euphony of his poetry, to inform my translations. And I'm sure Professor Susheela used her own manner of understanding Antamurthy's work. And Tariq, I'm sure, has his own take on it as a part of the National Translation Mission. So, I think.
Oh, yes. Will you tell us how you have, changes in translation? What has happened? Has the template changed over time? Does our government dictate to you what we translate? What's our template? Because I was sitting through the morning sessions in the same place, and they were talking about tribal stories and novels and stories. Even Maitreyi Devi has written stories like that. The literary merit of stories which you borrow from tribals or marginalized groups who have no script. So how are they incorporated? How is this injustice set right through the National Commission?
Let me first begin by thanking the organizers to include a representative from the National Translation Mission in this program. Our focus is on non-literary translation in the first place, but its translation, as we consider, is an act of inclusion. And even in non-literary, even in what is labeled as non-literary translation, there is a lot of literariness. Our focus at present is on knowledge texts. What we mean by knowledge texts are those texts which are used as pedagogical materials in higher education, in schools and colleges, for self-learning and various other institutions. A lot of changes have happened on that front, and a lot of initiatives the government has taken recently. I think these initiatives are worth mentioning here. I would first like to mention about the changes that we have observed recently. For many people, the act of translation is like a wholesome activity where you go to an ATM machine, put the source language and get the target language and come back. But even if you look at this metaphorical example of an ATM machine, you'll notice that you also go there to check your balance, you go there to take meaning statement, you go there to transfer money to somebody else. There are several other features available. Similarly, in the translation enterprise, you have several activities involved. Somewhere you are asked to do transliteration. It can be a requirement for transcription. There can be a requirement for interpretation or adaptation or subtitling or dubbing. There is a long list of activities which remain unnoticed under the umbrella term called translation. This is something that has been there for a very long time. But the change that has happened recently is the involvement of machine translation and AI tools. That has affected a lot of changes. Now, even if we tend to translate ourselves, if there is an availability, we would like to check it through machine translation and try to know how the machine is translating. So we are not able to avoid machine translation at all at this point of time. Now, this has come in many guises. One way in which people have perceived is now machine translation has come, so task has become all easy, and it is something that is automatic and reliable, but that does not happen. when we also go to say Google Translate or Microsoft Bing or Yandex or any such software, we check for the target text, but then we don't totally rely upon them. There is a need for what is called post-editing. And post-editing is something that requires our attention at the moment. All kinds of machine translations that we are seeing today are in need of post-editing and validation. Validation is not done by machines, it's done by the human beings. If a text is translated, say on Google Translate or anywhere, it requires attestation by a human group, which will say that this is acceptable as a translation. Other changes that are also occurring in the area of translation and translation studies includes the introduction. It starts from the introduction of the National Education Policy 2020. What we notice is after the introduction of National Education Policy 2020, a lot of centers started coming up, centers focusing on translation and interpretation. It's because the National Education Policy provides for knowledge in all languages, and that would be possible only when translation is happening in all those languages.
Can I just interrupt you? When you talk of, all the input that you are giving the whole mission, what about, this is for exchange between peoples and groups, isn't it? It's more in terms of exchange. What is the input that you get from states and individual regional languages? Is there an input in terms of what they have? Somebody was cribbing about tribals having been freedom fighters long before Gandhi came on the scene. Or any other input, stories or knowledge base, indigenous knowledge, which could be food related, which could be anything. Is that an input from states towards this mission?
No, the only input that we receive is picking up those texts which are used as foundation texts across the universities across the country, because all this is based on public money. Whatever is spent should be reaching out to the maximum number of people possible. So the books that are selected by experts teaching in various universities, conducting surveys, what is being prescribed as syllabi across the country, and such texts are taken up first. Other texts which are not published or which are not part of syllabus at the moment are not taken up yet. But yeah, they are worthy of inclusion in this enterprise, maybe at a later stage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That sounds interesting, because now, as it stands now, we hear that, our history books are being written, rewritten, our literature books are being, prioritized in certain fashion. We can't help it. We've reached a stage, it's not only us, all over the world. Camps are polarized one against the other. So to make a judicious decision in this regard, apart from government support, is there an independent academic body which decides on what this knowledge base will be? Because it's so vast, you see, we are into something which we can't handle. So how do you go about it?
It's a very inclusive policy that is adopted there. It's not like government has identified a book and said that you translate this book. Rather, it is a list which is prepared by visiting various universities and institutions, by conducting surveys and trying to know from subject experts and language experts what would be most essential at the moment. And we know that we have somewhere around 120 disciplines in which courses are offered. Maybe many more new have also have come. So some disciplines would take priority because more number of people would be asking for materials in that. What we understand from that is a lot of students are not able to perform very well at the higher education because they have received their secondary education in their languages, and their performance is affected because the textbooks are available in English. They would be doing well if the knowledge were available in their languages. So in order to bring parity, such an attempt is there. The effort is only to include such books which are prescribed as textbooks.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we should move on to the second half of the discussion regarding translation for change. Okay.
Yeah.
You We're quite keen on telling us how translation can be monitored to engineer change in society.
Yeah, translation for change. Yeah, that's my part now. I come in there. Um, this is the thing that translators do through publishers. Actually, it's through publishers. It's the publishers who are doing it, and publishers in collaboration with academicians. And then they get hold of translators to translate the books. For instance, I translated Bhartipura in 2010. And Anantamurthy's, no, what's the name? Vaidehi's Asprusyaru in 2010 and 2020, 2010 and 2012, 2010 and 2012. Now at that point, did I choose the text? I didn't. I knew nothing about translation at that point. OUP asked me to translate. So see, that's what happens. The publisher gets in touch with academicians and then decide on what the writers, think of potential translators, I think, and see what they translate. And then what happens is there is a current, a kind of a change that carries on and on. I translated these, but then you see, for the longest time, we never had anything like Dalit writing. Now we have translation of Dalit writings. I did two. One Atmakatha and one is a story. Story by Arvind Malagatti, novel by Arvind Malagatti. And that's just so amazingly interesting. You know why? Because it's very similar in theme and treatment to Anantamurthy's Bhartipura, not Bhartipura, what's the first? Samskara. Samskara. How, just imagine the excitement that there will be in a classroom if they are discussing these two. These two. The theme is the same, the treatment is also the same. Amazing it changed. That will bring about an amazing change. And similarly, then this Atmakatha that I was talking about, what's his name? Samboli by Lakshman. Atmakathas they're not autobiographies, well structured. They are more like journals, more like personal. And that is a problem because Samboli, Lakshman writes in his own vernacular, I can say, really. It's a kind of Kannada that needs a lot of explanations, interpolations, that I would call them interpolations. Give you a better example of interpolation from that, not actually better, but more graphic. See, when I was doing, what's his name? Divakara's Runa. When I was doing Divakara's Runa, it's a story of a personal experience of Masti Venkatesh Iyengar with his cobbler, Ramaya. And then when Masti explains that, I had to translate it with support, not actually a kind of a help, so that the reader can understand it. Because in English, we don't have an equivalent for Runa. So he says, I feel a kind of a Runanubandha with this man, a connection with through some past lives. I feel an obligation to help him. So that kind of a structure, a structural support there helps the reader to get into the mood of the thing. Even what's the name? Whether his Krauncha Pakshigalu. Krauncha Pakshigalu. It's a story about the partition times. There also, I can't translate the title as, say, curlews, waterfalls, or something like that. I can't do that because the Krauncha Pakshigalu is a specific connection with the fate of two waterfalls, which inspired Valmiki to write the Ramayana. So I have to keep it as Krauncha Pakshigalu and bring out the flavor. Talking about flavor, really, I think the most difficult was Divakar's stories, because all the setting is Tamil, always. The characters are all Tamilians. And at one conference, one gentleman A participant actually came and said, "Madam, I knew you translate from Kannada. I never knew you translate from Tamil also." I said, "No, these are all Kannada stories." See, the compliment there is as much to the writer as to the translator. That has to come, that kind of a change, because the reader has to enter the story, feel it, and feel the change within him or herself. And it's the best thing that can happen is if these are prescribed in colleges, where there will be discussion on these things. And there is a kind of a mind change in the students. Then teaching also becomes dynamic if that is done. And fortunately now there are universities that can prescribe their own syllabus. In Tamil Nadu, one college prescribed my translation of Nadi Souza's Dvipa. Can you imagine the kind of discussions there might have been, because we are all interested in environment now, environment and environmental policies. And what about the impact on students of environmental science, environmental policy? That is the kind of change we must bring about.
On that note, if I can add, how do we guard? See, our quarrel with Orientalists was that they made us out into be some museum pieces, with elephants and snake charmers and all that. If we are adding so many footnotes and afterwards and forwards and all that, how do we guard against a literary text becoming an anthropological, sociological text? That's to you. And I'm very charmed by your recent production of Bendre's poems. How important, to add to what Susheela was saying, how important is it to bolster it, to support a text with this kind of footnoting? Where do you limit it? Do we make a full package of a translation when we hand it over to the reader? This in the light of the dwindling readership. Now we've moved into a digital format and readership is dwindling. Of course, Litfests are all crowded, that's very rewarding. But how do we?
Yeah, thanks, Susan.
I could do that.
Yeah, this is a question I think that, and also listening to Professor Tariq and Susheela has given me a couple of ideas, so I'd like to just talk about them. The first thing is, Professor Susheela said that she tries to keep a Kannada flavor and it should read like a translation. Now I think that's up for debate and it has been debated. Should a translation read like a translation or should it read like an original in English or the language it's been translated into in order to appeal to the reader? There are different schools of thought. I think you should retain a flavor of the original without seeming as though it was sort of forced into the target language, so to speak. But again, I suppose it depends on the text that we're speaking of and whether it's prose or poetry or a combination of those two. I think Susan should talk about her own translation of Devanura's Kusuma Bale and how she navigated that. As far as this question of, what was it that you said, Susan? The production, yes. I began to translate Bendre on my own and began to put it up on a blog where an audio component was available. And because he's such a euphonic poet, I began to add audio recordings of his original poetry and my own recitations of my translations on the blog because it was possible. And then when the idea of making a book of it began, I was looking to see what to do, and I was helped by my father in this, and he told me, he suggested something like a QR code, the new age equivalent of those CDs we used to find at the back of books, And so that's what now this book includes. It includes these QR codes that you can scan and listen to, or you can use to listen to the original poem and the translation. And the reason for that is because it's so important. I thought that Bendre's poetry be listened to, since he's such a nada-based poet, such a euphony-based poet. And this kind of packaging wasn't done for academic purposes. There are afterwards in the book, but to answer your question, Susan, I'd say that I still think we should present a translation as far as possible without these supplements when the reader first reads them. They can perhaps be added later, but on the first reading, I think we should look as far as possible to retain a flavor of the original without maybe burdening the reader with footnotes, as it were.
Okay, to go back to you, what we have done with the literary criticism is to leave out linguistics completely. Maybe stylistics has gotten through the back door. And so this rigor of, staying with the text has always been a matter that has been discussed and debated. Through your now, the purpose that literary criticism or literary text achieves is that it's the only thematized thing where the human being, his emotions are involved. Okay, it's the only discipline which is thematized, where our feelings, our emotions are all involved. So when it's a knowledge-based translation, which has to be absorbed by a large population, earlier lyric, narrative, performance, whatever we had, so many folk forms, they helped us assimilate that knowledge. Greece also had this utilitarian thing of, bringing knowledge together. So it's a big challenge for a translation mission to allow this knowledge base to percolate into our people, isn't it? Without it remaining an examination paper matter.
Yes, it is. I would like to add that apart from emotions, our aspirations are also involved. And these aspirations are in the young generation who want to become doctors, engineers, and without losing their languages. They don't need to be fluent in English just to pursue a particular profession. So that way, we feel that the activities of translation, especially with respect to textbooks of higher education, is very important. We have been able to succeed to some extent, and we see that a lot of new institutions have come up very strongly, and they are also contributing to this effect. Universities, several other government agencies, state government agencies, they all are participating in this program. The roadblocks that we face here are from sometimes publishers who are not very keen to share translation rights, and they have an apprehension that their source text would not sell much if translated texts are circulated in the market, or sometimes they feel that there would be loss when translation of a source text takes place. That is why they go on to bring out new editions every 2 or 3 years. And now this is a very big challenge for us, even when the publishers have shared the rights with us, because when we complete a particular translation, the market has a new edition of the source text. Why would a reader pick up an old edition in the form of translation? So these are some of the things that we are trying to navigate, but then recent changes in technology has enabled us to manage the translation activity, not just getting something done on Google Translation, but also translation activity on the whole. There are several new softwares which are capable of making several collaborations, parallel translations, like one book which is getting translated into, say, 22 languages together, and the exercise can be monitored with a single hit of a button. All that is in a very nascent stage, and we need to do a lot before we are complacent.
Is there a push towards AI?
Yes, there is. AI for Bharat is working very dedicatedly, monitored from IIT Chennai. It is focusing on preparation of such tools and utilities which will be helping in developing AI in Indian languages.
One thing I thought worth adding as far as translation for change is concerned, I think given the cachet of English, the prestige English holds now, it may be that the only way to bring a language that's lesser known to light is to go through English and get its speakers, give the cachet of English to the language's native speakers in some way. Susan, I was thinking of how Tagore winning the Nobel Prize sort of brought cachet to Bengali in a way that it's done to no other language in India. And if say Bendre had been awarded the Nobel, which a lot of people believe he deserved, and so many other writers too, it would have brought a kind of, it would have through English returned to the language a certain prestige that it deserves, but is being lost on account of the homogenization as well as the increasing hegemony of English. And so that I think it can work in a backward manner where popularizing Bendre will get Kannada speakers reading Bendre and getting back to Kannada rather than just reading him through the English. So that was something
I would like to reflect upon what Madhav has said just now. It is commonly understood that there is a mediating language, and most often this is English. But we at National Translation Mission have a very different experience, and that is several translators prefer to use an Indian language as a medium, and they go for some other language, not English particularly. And this is also because of a linguistic factor. There is a lot of morphological and lexical similarities among Indian languages. We need to realize that. And English has a very different syntax. So this commonness of the usage of words and word development process has helped translation in a big way. I stop it. Thank you.
Is there any tie-up with Sahitya Academy?
A lot of agencies are participating together. Sahitya Academy is ex officio member of our scheme of things. So it's always putting together heads and doing common things for common good.